So hi, the QR code should be obvious enough. My slides are available online embedded in a web page on my site. So if you want to follow along, you can. If you want to read ahead, you'll only be a little bit more confused than everybody else. I'm hoping you're going to come away from this talk rethinking how you might approach some patterns that you're used to. I'm using code throughout as illustration. It is not copy-paste ready code. And I include the code and links to more detail in the article off of that QR code. If you aren't scanning it, it's rosel.li/Øredev02. This is an ego slide. It's just for my ego. Ideally, everything in here should stand on merits, but it might be good to know that the guy talking to you has done some stuff. Whatever. Okay, so under-engineered how? You've probably come here and you're wondering what about what I'm talking about actually makes it under-engineered. Mostly I'm talking about things that lean on minimal code. I use native HTML elements and controls throughout. I use as little styling as possible. I don't call any third-party scripts or any third-party styles. I add ARIA attributes only when necessary, and I ensure everything is accessible by default. So if you saw my talk yesterday where I talked about WCAG, I'm not talking about WCAG today, but the good news is it's baked into everything I'm covering here. So everything should be accessible unless you don't do what I say, in which case that's on you. So this is a talk about going back to the basics for the most part. And that's because from experience, once we strap on complex designs or move away from native interactions by default, we make the accessibility harder to achieve and the code becomes that much more complex. It's easier to introduce regressions, breaks, and other things. My patterns are accounting for assorted states, including disabled states, errored states. They support when the user is scaling, whether they're just scaling the text in the browser or zooming in on the page. They meet contrast minimums under WCAG. They support Windows high contrast mode, which has now been standardized into forced colors mode. They support reduced motion. They support light or dark color schemes that the user might set in the OS or otherwise. They support being printed. There are still people who print web pages. I understand in Germany that's a requirement. Print a web page from a PDF. I don't know. It's a long story I got dragged into. They're also meant to work with non-right to left languages. So I'm an American. I speak American and nothing else because ego. But I try to at least make these styles account for languages that are not my own. So first up, we're going to dive into text boxes. And I call the plural of boxen, like ox. You can harass me later outside the room. We won't have time. I didn't start this. I have no idea how late I'm going to run now. Okay, so text fields might be the simplest to adapt to any design system. So instead of reaching for a library or a big framework, you only really need 3 CSS declarations to inherit, to adapt stuff. Font inherit, letter spacing inherit, and word spacing inherit are the heavy lift here. They do the bulk of the work. Apply those to text area, apply them to input, and because of the general input selector, it will also affect submit buttons. Nice bonus for anybody who still uses submit buttons. Also reset buttons. I haven't seen one of those in the wild in years. If you're using them, good on you for keeping it real. The font declaration will inherit all of these properties. So font size, font family, font style, font variant, font weight, font stretch, font height, and even line height. You get all of that for free off of that one declaration. Because text boxes are unaffected when letter spacing or word spacing are applied to their ancestors, you'll need to explicitly inherit those. This is useful if you're supporting success criterion 1.4.12 text spacing within WCAG. See, I'm going to talk about WCAG. Sorry, it's just how I'm wired. So far, I haven't found these declarations in any CSS resets. So if you already have a CSS reset that you like, you might want to yank these into it. This screenshot looks much better on my screen. It was captured in Firefox. Chrome looked about the same. I was too lazy to fire up the Mac. But this shows up this shows the default styling for text fields and other input types in the browser. Note that the font is smaller and the text area, it uses a fixed width font. We apply those styles and now at least they look consistent. These aren't pretty, and I'm not trying to make them pretty. I'm just trying to make them adapt to whatever is already on the page. The spaced text fields also honor the letter and line spacing from the surrounding text. Those are the two in the upper right. Pretty straightforward. So with those three declarations, you mostly don't need to worry about internationalization or localization because the browser will handle any non-left to right text. Forced colors mode, also known as Windows high contrast mode. It's now contrast themes in Windows 11 because why not? Those will work as expected. And for users who print forms, they'll print as the same size as the rest of the text on the page. If you've ever printed a form, sometimes the fields are small and stupid. You can enhance these a bit if you want. You don't have to, but with clearer borders, better padding, more obvious styles for some states, such as disabled, read-only, required, errored. And then there you build in your dark mode styles, honor WCAG contrast requirements, and make sure the page can still be machine translated for users who are maybe not using their native language in the operating system and just want to automatically translate the page. So I'm making a more complex selector here to select checkbox and radios, images, files, and range sliders. It's very specific. You can judge that selector as you see fit. It's very explicit just to show you what I'm trying to do. I set a border width in M units because I want to ensure it scales with the text. I don't set a color in there though, because I want that color to inherit. I make the border solid. I purge the bevel that some browsers still use because they think it's 1995. I give it some breathing room with padding based on the M unit. So as you scale your text, the padding scales, doesn't get squished into the side. You could use rems, comes down to whatever works for your design system, etc. Just try to use relative units if you can. The not selectors are supported back to IE 9. Right? Internet Explorer 9. Yeah, I still have some government clients. So, yeah, I demand extra money from them. WCAG Success Criterion 247 Focus Visible means you don't have to do anything for focus styles because you're leaning on the browser defaults. You could just leave them as they are. But, you know, do something. Don't be a jerk. So I set a bright blue outline. I set a shadow. Offset a little bit, do whatever suits your design. But now that you're choosing colors, you do have to honor WCAG contrast requirements. Now you have a responsibility, so don't mess that up. Also consider the sphere dark theme. As long as your label indicates that a field is required, ideally have the required or ARIA required attribute. Which one you choose is a function of your testing suite, your audience, etc. But you don't need to style the field any differently. A few years ago, however, I experimented with a visual style to reinforce this. I had a client who loved it, and it worked well for their audience on that system, and it isn't necessarily something I would just release into the wild without explanation. All I did is thicken the border on the left. So if the border was fat, you knew it was a required field. I used the logical property border inline start width instead of border left, the idea being that it will automatically shift for a non-left to right language. So switch it to Arabic, Hebrew, boom, it just works. A red border alone will always be insufficient to indicate an error state. So I stuffed this little red marker in the corner as a visual cue. Again, you don't have to do this. This was just an example of a thing that I did. It uses a hard gradient, and then it goes to transparent, so it works in dark mode. It'll work in high contrast mode. You do you, of course, whatever works. I use ARIA invalid in my selector instead of just colon invalid, because if you're using colon invalid, that implies that you're relying on browsers for error handling and error messages. Don't do that. I have a whole talk about that. Just don't do that. But if you're already doing it, hey. Years ago, I had a client who used read-only fields all the time. They loved them. So I came up with a style that removed all but the bottom border. It implied that something had been filled out, but you couldn't change it. Google Material Design kind of ruined that, as Google Material Design ruins everything. So I'm only showing it now just to show off the logical properties that I used, border inline start, border block start, border inline end, just to represent left, top, and right. My suggestion, though, is just avoid read-only fields. And if you're going to use logical properties, ensure that those are supported in your audience's browsers. So when I bring all of these together, we do not have beautiful text fields. But what you have are text fields that are adapting to the user's preferences, that can be adapting to your design system, all with only a little bit of CSS. So now layer in your own styles, adjust your selectors, just adapt as you see fit. This is also using dark mode instead of non-dark mode. The thicker border, the red corner, chit are all visible. So I put some fields in Hebrew just to show how they switch. The positions of things just change automatically. Okay, select menus. If you're forced to use select menus, sorry. If you willingly use them. So anyway, this CSS should be kind of familiar. We're inheriting the font, the letter spacing, and the word spacing. This is the bare minimum. You don't need to do anything else. This is what they look like by default. This is using Chrome. That small text doesn't match the page, doesn't quite look right. Definitely does not honor text spacing settings, but with those 3 declarations, now we've got text that at least matches the surrounding text and adapts to the user preferences. So 3 declarations. The Filament group a few years ago put together a comprehensive set of styles to give authors more control over select menus. I've dramatically simplified it because they were imposing design decisions, and I'm doing the opposite. I'm trying to remove a bunch of them. So I use their appearance none declaration to purge the arrow icon. And I use the WebKit and Moz prefix versions. I drop an SVG background image arrow into the control, but I only do it for selects that are not multi-selects, which is why I have that not multiple attribute selector. Also, that's not the full SVG. The ellipsis implies that there's far more code in there that I'm not going to bore you with. So from here, copy the styles from the text button. Make a better border, give it some padding, duplicate the styles for focused, required, errored, disabled, read-only, whatever. And then roll up any styles you have for non-English, non-left to right text. Work in your own dark mode styles. So carrying these styles gets us a select menu that, while it's not pretty, it matches the text boxes and the surrounding text on the page. For those organizations who use multi-selects, stop. But if you're doing it anyway, the styles will carry over to them as well. You'll just need to tweak a couple things here and there. So this shows the basic field and a required field, again with that heavier, thicker border on the left, just showing these styles in play. Not pretty, but mostly to get the point across. This image shows a field that's in error, a field that's disabled, another field that's required, errored, and in a non-left to right Arabic text. Do I hear applause from the other room? Is it like tomorrow? Oh, I love that you guys are screwing with me. I hate you. Prior versions of iOS had a feature that zoomed in on a select menu when it got focus. Developers would then set a 16-pixel font size to prevent it. But the thing is, as long as your base font is not smaller than the default, which I covered, it would fix that. So anyway, while this video is playing in the background, one of the features of native select menus is that on mobile, they dismiss on a gesture. Simple gesture, they go away. Android TalkBack, for example, down and left closes the native select. On the custom select, if you're building one from a third-party library, down and left will navigate the user back 1 step in the browsing history. So if nothing else, this can be incredibly annoying to users who've just opened a field and then try to swipe it away and end up going back, maybe losing everything they've been working on. So bear in mind, this can also be a barrier for many of your users. Oh, good, the video stopped. It's a long video, so I had to talk through it because it's boring. Here is the same impact, the same effect on iOS. This is not just an Android thing. So I'm showing the 2-finger right then left gesture. I don't actually have my fingers in the screen. I don't know how you can do that with a screen capture. It would hurt, I'm sure. So I show dismissing the native select, then I show the same gesture will navigate backward in the browser history, which, again, huge problem. Oh, good. Yeah, close enough. The video's online. I'm trying to sort of move through things at speed so you can all get to a snack. I shouldn't have said that. Now I'm hungry. So, checkboxing and radio buttons. They operate similarly to one another, at least as far as choosing the selector. So if all you need for your checkboxes is to match a color scheme, that's it, accent color. Obviously, make sure the contrast is good. If you have a dark mode, account for that as well. But that's all you need. Move on with your life. These screenshots show a set of radio buttons just using accent color. Both checked indicators and the focus styles use the accent color. I captured this in Firefox. Like I said, you could be done here. But if somebody that you hate has decided that that is not enough, you can go down the path of customizing these controls. It's a little trickier, of course, especially when you think about how you might denote required and errored radios and checkboxes, because they're not part of the control itself. You'll also need to come up with the checked states, mixed state, and a focus state. Checkboxes do allow a mixed state, which is awesome, but weird if you're not used to it. All of that, of course, needs to adapt to dark mode, high contrast mode, internationalization changes, and WCAG contrast requirements. So this way be dragons, but we're going to run through it quickly, and I'm going to try to do this relatively quickly. So visually, we remove them from the page, because we're going to replace them with our own terrible design. But we're only removing them visually, not programmatically. So don't use CSS display none, because that removes them from the accessibility tree. That just removes them from the DOM. Done. This here, I'm just making them 1 pixel in size. So this style might look familiar to some of you who use the visually hidden class. Scott O'Hara noted last year that, or wait, more than a year ago, that you probably don't need those styles. You can probably get away with this appearance none declaration. And then to address a Safari bug, background, probably a property that matches your page color. That's it. I mean, now you've visually removed them from the page. So now you have a clean canvas to make whatever terrible design that you've been asked to do. All of these styles also presume this HTML construct, the for ID pairing. I am not wrapping the text, I'm not wrapping the element inside the label. And I don't do that because there is a bug in Dragon Naturally Speaking, Dragon Dictate, which still isn't fixed as far as I know. It's also undocumented, so I do not wrap my form fields inside the label because shit breaks. Is shit a curse in Swedish? No? Nice, so I won't get bleeped. And then I use CSS generated content to provide the visual components. So you will need to handle sizing, spacing, alignment, colors, cursor, and positioning. I tossed some logical properties in there. Man, that's complex to read. Assuming, again, support for logical properties. Note there's a float and vertical align, which means you'll still need to adapt those for any non-right to left languages, or rather non-left to right. See, even I'm confused. Tweaking it for the radio button by making it into a circle is just a function of giving a border radius of 100%. Now it's round. And then I use a box shadow and a background color. I animate that with a transition property, and boom, there's my radio. The checkbox indicator, though, can't be solved with a shadow. So I'm using another bit of CSS generated content. I'm making a rectangle, putting a border only on 2 sides, and rotate it into place. Now it looks like a check. For the mixed state, I only put the border on 1 side, so it just looks like a horizontal line, and I don't rotate it. I talked about right to left languages before. You might need a separate media query here, or feature query, language query, whatever. So if you use that floating technique, you'll need to flip those float styles. And then you'll need to account for Windows high contrast mode, contrast themes, force colors, whatever. If you have a dark theme, account for that. Maybe print styles, because when these are printed, it's nice for people to know what they checked, assuming, again, they print them. You could also just revert to the browser defaults when they're printed. Might even be easier. And at this point, I just want to use that accent color thing I showed you from a few slides ago, because That's a lot. It's still less, though, than you get from bringing in a lot of libraries or frameworks. And it's still using native HTML under the hood. So here they are with the custom styles I put together in dark mode. English, the text is on the left. In my image, so I actually have dotted outlines for focus styles, which just don't display well when they're projected, obviously. I also don't know if a check mark changes direction in Hebrew, but you can change that as appropriate, if so. So this is still less than pulling in from a third party, but you're still using native HTML, like I said. I also didn't add any ARIA in here, nor did I add any JavaScript. These will just work. Again, it's your decision on whether or not you want to do all this. Toggles. I understand toggles are a thing people use. I don't know why. They're effectively, what I'm building here are effectively native HTML controls that you use to create a toggle. And if you don't know what one looks like, it's the little pill slidey thinger that you never know if it's on or off, ever. If there's only one, it's like, what do I do? But I have two approaches here. Use a checkbox if you want something that relies on progressive enhancement, and or the user has to hit a separate submit button for it to take effect. If you want it to take effect immediately and you're confident JavaScript is available, use a button with ARIA pressed. Visually, they'll end up looking the same. Programmatically, they're a little bit different under the hood. But again, it's basic HTML, a checkbox with a label, and a button with ARIA press. My click events are inline because I was born into web development in the 1990s. It also makes it easier for me to find them. Regardless of which you choose, though, like I said, you can make them look the same. So I just have the before and after for each one. Mostly we're reusing the CSS to remove the default checkbox that we used earlier. For the button, we remove all the button styles, but keep the text because that is our label here. Then we use CSS-generated content to create the pill shape and the thumb slider thinger. These are fake selectors, obviously. I'm just showing you that they're similarly styled and how your selectors might look. If you use a button as your toggle, you'll need to add some script, of course, to toggle that ARIA pressed value. This gets the job done. You might have a much better function, but I didn't have to bring in a library or a framework. Like there isn't a 2 meg download of Vue. Toggles can be left or right depending on, I don't know, somebody made up some rules, but they can be left or right. Both checkboxes and ARIA press buttons can also have a mixed state. So remember to create styles for that. And then of course, make sure you have good focus states. If you're not sure the mixed state, I use airplane mode as the common example because airplane mode is not a binary once you turn on Bluetooth to pair with the headphones of the person in the next seat just to mess with them. The on-off state changes sides for right to left languages, I think. So account for that. Obviously confirm it with somebody who's a native speaker of those languages. Should these toggle buttons also include text saying on or off? Yes, all toggle buttons should, but I'm just showing you the bare minimum here. Also, this won't win any design awards. I'm a little bit proud of that. And here are the same things as seen in Microsoft Edge running Windows High Contrast mode. The Wi-Fi button in the upper right is focused right now, so I have a little gray dimple in the middle and then a dotted outline. But Windows High Contrast mode, surprisingly easy to account for. I did not use the ARIA switch role throughout, and partly because the switch role doesn't allow a mixed state. You can't, so that Wi-Fi example I showed you would be disallowed. ARIA checked and ARIA pressed both allow for it. The standard checkbox allows for it as well. A bigger reason I don't use this switch role is just it's announced inconsistently across screen reader and browser pairings. It's not an issue for the most part unless your testers are really, really concerned about how it sounds. Users will typically know what it is. Unlike the first few patterns, though, these are very much not under-engineered because I put a lot of CSS on here, but I'm still using native HTML, minimal or no JavaScript in order to make it happen. multi-select. We're going to use a little bit of script here because I'm not going to make you use a select element with multiple because I don't want your users to hate you more than they do. Earlier, I recommended against it, obviously. Usability practitioners have spent 3 decades telling people not to use select multiple. They might be right. The list box pattern from ARIA, not a good fit either. It's already, the ARIA list box pattern is a shaky foundation, and once you start to allow multiple selections in it, it tends to confuse users, and sometimes it falls down in exciting ways in browsers. So what native control allows a user to choose more than one thing from a set? Checkboxes. And a field set, of course, because you need a group label. Also with a skip link, because we don't hate our keyboard-only users, and we don't want them to have to tab through an entire alphabet of animals. It's a tab stop nightmare. In its simplest form, this is it. It's a field set with a legend, a skip link, and a ton of checkboxes, so you can bypass those. But you might hate tall content. A lot of my clients genuinely hate tall content. They think scrolling is bad. Like it's a demon thing. If you just want to make for a more manageable layout, you don't want it to take up the whole page, make it scroll. I've added a tab index equals 0. So that's the first step. That means that a keyboard user can at least put focus on the container. And then I set a height, I set a width because I don't want the scroll bar to be all the way across the screen. I want it to at least be near the controls. Typically, you should choose a height that clips one of the options so a user can at least see a word is cut off. And that's a cue that there's more going on there. And I also have a style, which I think I cover later, that has an inset shadow. So it looks like there's more happening. The legend doesn't need a position sticky, though, because it just hangs out at the top all on its own, which is a great feature unless you've ever been asked to style a legend. Then you know how annoying that can be. But now we've got a stack of checkboxes. It doesn't push the rest of the page out of the viewport because we can choose whatever height we want. But if you hate field sets, which is apparently all of my clients, you can use an ARIA group role. You have to give an accessible name, of course, so you're replacing the legend. But we want to keep the scroll, so we're adding a tab index to that div. So it's got a role, ARIA labeled by, because ARIA label will not translate automatically when it's inline in all browsers, so probably avoid ARIA label anyway. So now we make it scroll. Same deal, the selector makes sure that all 3 of those attributes are there before it will scroll, because you don't want to hide content if there isn't a tab index. Otherwise, your keyboard users can't get to it. Notice that I add a scroll padding top because I'm setting aside space for the thing that's going to replace the legend, which will be the group label essentially. And then I make that sticky. Then I give it a background. I give that label a background because otherwise the checkboxes will show through behind it, and that just looks weird. And I'm assuming in this code that you've already set the page background with a variable or not. You do you if you like copy pasting white all over the place. So it's still a scrolling stack of checkboxes, but you've replaced the legend with more code because somebody hates field sets. But still, we're building on some simple HTML patterns. Some of my clients hate letting people just glance at all of the choices. Jerks. So now we're going to remove that ability with a surgical application of a disclosure widget, which is actually still not a lot of code. I have a lot going on in here, but it's fundamentally not a lot of code. So our group label is now a button, and the button lives outside the group. ARIA labeled by references its text, so cool, we got the label associated. We're leaning on JavaScript. We have to, so we can provide a count of choices. So if we're going to hide all these choices, we can at least tell users there are 26 choices here. Here's the count of how many you've selected. So we're giving them a little extra for the punishment that our client made us do, because clients. And you might notice that the skip link is still there. I'll come to that in a little bit. So the progressive enhancement is important here. When the script runs, it drops a data.js attribute onto the button. And then I use that attribute to do a few things. I hide the checkboxes. I show the counter. I position the checkboxes over the other content, like on top of it, and then I hide the skip link. So now we have a control that's not quite like, but not quite unlike what a user might expect from a multi-select. It's very clearly a set of checkboxes, though. And I have two versions of it here. It operates as a set of checkboxes, which is what's most important. But it also progressively enhances. What that means is if the script does not run, which we see in the second image, there's a skip link and no content is hidden. No script, no problem. It's just the previous pattern all over again. This video is 18 seconds. I don't know if I have the energy to play the whole thing or the time. Anyway, the first 7 seconds just shows how the control behaves when JavaScript is not enabled. And this is when the JavaScript is running. You can see it has a count, 0, 1 of 26 selected, and I'm not forcing my page to scroll any further. But under the hood, it's still checkboxes with a disclosure widget containing the whole thing. Okay, a new pattern. Dependency questions. How am I doing on time? I don't know. I started that late, so nobody's hungry, right? Specifically, if you're choosing one item from a group and that reveals more choices, that's what I'm referring to as dependency questions. So here's 2 groups of radio buttons. Each has an other option. So choose one of these or choose other. When the other option is selected, more fields appear and those ask for more detail. So given everything that we've covered so far, you might have some guesses on how I do this. I don't want to know if you're right or wrong because I'll feel bad. But, I mean, that's it. That's the entirety of the script. So I'm using a checked pseudo class wrapped by a not pseudo class with a general sibling combinator, all associated with the ID of the field that happens to be the trigger. It's a lot of words. It's one line of CSS. That's it. I'm hiding the stuff that we don't care about yet. Have I spoken over two slots now? What is happening? I'm terrified. Oh, they're clapping for me? No, thank you. My ego thanks you. For this model to work as I'm describing it, though, you need a flat HTML structure. Only one div, and it holds the content that you want to hide. So it's probably a departure from what you're used to, where every field and every label is wrapped in a div. Those won't work with the way I'm outlining it right now. Anyway, we can pull this layout off just using CSS Flexbox. Flexbox handles our layout, removing the need for all of that HTML. Might not work, again, for a variety of reasons, if you're inheriting code, if you're just trying to style something up. But again, this is one line of one line of CSS, rather, that can do this work. And then one line of script that will. No, I'm not using script. Why did I say that? It's not even in my notes. Clearly, I'm making crap up. But the important thing here is the has selector, which isn't really a selector, but once has is supported in Firefox, which I believe the target date is December 15th for Firefox 120. Once has support, you don't even need the flat HTML structure anymore. Now you can do a selector that basically says, does this div have a checked thing? Work your way up and back down. Anyway, coming back to the form fields, I want to head off any concerns anybody here might have about WCAG, because I'm not changing the URL, I'm not changing the viewport, I'm not changing focus, like all these things aren't happening. This does not fail 322 on input. If you find your users are confused, a little warning, instruction text, things like that will manage it. But all I'm doing is adding nodes after where the user currently has focus. So they will just continue to move through the field. We're not moving them around the page. We're not doing anything terrible. Of course, this can break for a variety of reasons, so you'll need to see how it fits into your code, if it's a fit or not. This is the last section. Even I'm excited. I expect to hear applause one more time from over there. Anyway, this is actually a... I don't even know what to do now. I just want to lay down. Anyway, this should be the most straightforward section of everything I've covered so far. I mentioned earlier I wanted to come back to the whole tab index and why and how I'm leaning on that. The first step here is wrap your table inside a div that scrolls. So this way a keyboard user needs to be able to, or will be able to perform a scrolling action. That's what the tab index allows. Once it can receive focus, it has to have an appropriate role and accessible name, of course. Otherwise, we have all sorts of WCAG violations. So in this case, I use the region role because it's just generic. Doesn't hurt anybody, nobody panics. If your table is full of form fields, the group role might be more appropriate. Again, depends on context. And then for the accessible name, I'm using ARIA labeled by to refer to the table's caption. If the page is machine translated, the caption will be translated, so that will be reflected in the accessible name. Then you'll need some CSS to make it scroll. This approach handles for success criterion 1.4.10 reflow by ensuring only the table scrolls, not the entire page. That first selector helps ensure that it will not scroll unless it has the appropriate role and an accessible name and a tab index, because I want to enforce success criterion 412 name role value. You can tweak these, swap the role, swap the accessible name, whatever the attribute is, but just make sure that those anchor on things that are on the page. So if your author leaves that out on the HTML, the user isn't confronted with a broken table, they're just confronted with a page that's more difficult to use. And then I add a focus style to meet success criterion 247 focus visible, and make sure it has good contrast for 1411 non-text contrast. See, I'm thinking about WCAG as I do all this stuff. I can't stop. This video is me tabbing through, tabbing to the table wrapper, which gives it focus, and then I scroll left and right. That's it. Now a keyboard user can access that table. Also, that pressed keys thing, Sarah Higley wrote that. I have a link to it in my post. I'm a big fan of Sarah Higley, so I'm always happy when I can drop her name. I expect her to watch this video later, and this is going to be so awkward for her. You may have noticed that for sighted users to scroll the table, I'm adding a lot of ARIA. Seems weird, but that's because only Firefox today, unless Chrome 120 has just launched, or 121, only Firefox today will let a keyboard user focus a scrolling region, or an overflowing region, which becomes a scrolling region. Chrome is making a change to that. They had that feature like 10 versions ago and then rolled it back because, I don't know, they did it wrong. But basically, we need the accessible role, we need the role, the accessible name, all of that, so that a screen reader user, when they land on this, doesn't say, what the hell did I just encounter? They're like, oh, okay, it's just a stupid table for stupid sighted people. Safari users, unfortunately, would need to rely on mouse keys if we didn't use this tactic, and that's a pain in the butt. And if you've ever heard of spatial navigation, it won't do the trick here. I have a whole post on that. It's incredibly boring. But like I said, Firefox handles the scrolling area without a tab index just fine. Here in the video, I put focus on the scrolling area just by tabbing to it, and then the arrow keys do the work for me. I love Firefox most of the time. Caroting. Caroting is not a verb. I made it up because you're caret browsing. I don't even know, whatever. This isn't playing yet, is it? No. So I spend the first 2 seconds just trying to tab to the scrolling area. I have no luck, of course. Then I type into the text box so you can see the text cursor indicator with those big purple bell ends. And then I press F7 to activate caret browsing, and spend the rest of the video using arrow keys just to move the text cursor. And that green arrow shows what a pain in the ass this is. Move along. On Mac OS, after enabling mouse keys, you use the number pad to move the mouse cursor, and then you press a key to emulate the mouse click. It's incredibly painful. I spent the first 13 seconds of this video just trying to tab to the scrolling area. There's no caret navigation in Safari, so that's not going to work either. Like, this video just goes on and on. No. Anyway, I think I may have actually brought this in close to time. I have no idea. So I'm going to do a quick wrap up, just in the interest of letting everybody go before there's yet more applause. Like I said, I have a blog post covering what I talked about here, which you can get to by this QR code or rosel.li/Øredev02. If you were in my talk yesterday and you scanned the QR code, you accidentally saw these slides a day early because I'm a twit. But that's fixed. But these slides, I already confirmed that they're there. You're going to also, if you go to that post, I link to a far more rambly discussion with Ben Myers on his Some Antics vodcast. I think it's linked in there already. And I do a better job in that video of giving credit to the people where I stole some of these ideas from. This is one of the things I want to reinforce. A lot of the stuff that I do, that I talk about, the accessibility industry broadly does, is built on the shoulders of all the people who've had to deal with this before us, including all the users who've had to suffer through some of our terrible decisions, Google Material Design. So if you glazed over the code bits, and if the styles were terrible, sorry, but all the information is there. I'm mostly hoping you come away from this with an understanding that HTML on its own does a really good job, and some minimal or weird styles and a little bit of scripting can get you all the way there. That's my talk. Thank you.